My name is Avneet Thapar. I'm a full-time activist with the Committee for the Republic of Canada and the International Larouche Movement. And I'm going to give a short synopsis of the whole event today. I'm going to make a short introduction, which I'm doing currently. Then I'm going to introduce Dennis Lastnam, who is a representative of the Russian community in Montreal, who has been very active along with this community in organizing and educating the public about the war danger and the Nazi coup in Ukraine, which includes not just people who are, it's not just the Russian community, but also people in Ukraine, people from the Ukrainian community, people from the general Eastern European community. And after Dennis's presentation, I'm going to give an overview of the strategic war danger and the BRICS orientation. And after my presentation, I'm going to have Jean-Philippe Leblou give a presentation on Kepler, which is our presentation, which is going to be in French. So people need translations, there are devices outside. After Jean-Philippe, we're going to have Bob Hux present on fusion and the power that's necessary for nations to harness fusion. And the last presentation after that is going to be Dave Gosselin on Schiller, Frederick Schiller. So welcome everybody, thanks for coming. The whole presentation is going to be about 2.5 hours. We're going to leave 30 minutes for question and answer, so please save your questions till the last. Please stay till the very end. And please put your phones on silent, and I'm going to bring Dennis right now.
Hi everyone, so my name is Dennis. I'm from the Russian community here in Montreal. We're actually organizing weekly events on every Saturday. Thank you. We're basically organizing weekly events to try and educate the public about what's going on in Eastern Ukraine and basically what's the danger of all of that when it comes to the global society and basically the global world division of what it could transpire. So basically, as you probably know that there's been conflict that's been going on for about a year in Ukraine so far. Not sure how many of you know about the actual origins of the conflict, so I'm going to give you a very short overview of what's happened. So basically, last February, there was an illegally elected government that was overthrown by some ultra-nationalistic movements in Ukraine. They include the Pravy sector, which means right sector. It's very right-wing, very nationalistic, and as well as the Svoboda party, which is basically the Freedom Party, but the name is really misleading. So those guys, they decided to kind of do a campaign against the legally elected pro-Russian government back in the day. They started by doing the Euromaidan, which you might have followed in the news. That kind of escalated into clashes with the police. It went over to quite a lot of brutality, but eventually the government was overthrown. What happened later on is that Crimea, that was the first region of Ukraine in the eastern Ukraine, which decided to basically separate from Ukraine because they said that you guys just did an illegal overthrow of the government, a military coup d'etat. We can no longer stay in the same boat. There was a referendum held over there at which over 96% of all the population actually voted to quit Ukraine and enter Russia. And that's pretty much what happened in retrospect. That's when Crimea became part of Russia. First they became independent, then they went to Russia. However, in eastern Ukraine, there's other provinces as well, specifically Lugansk province and Donetsk province. They kind of looked at what happened at Crimea and they thought, well, what if we follow the same way type of thing? What if we also decide to kind of, they actually didn't want to separate. At this point, they wanted to have a federalization of Ukraine. So basically changing the way the government works. They wanted to have more rights for the different provinces over there. Especially one of the key demands that they had was having a regional language as Russian, because the population there, 80% of them are basically, they're Russian speaking. So we're looking at that as kind of a situation in Quebec where most of the majority of the population is French speaking and the regional language over here is definitely French. So that's something that they wanted to do in those particular regions of Ukraine. Unfortunately, what happened is that the Kyiv government, instead of actually talking to them or doing negotiations or anything sort of like an agreement or whatever, they basically started a huge anti-terrorist operation, they called it. And with the anti-terrorist operation, they started basically shelling peaceful cities and killing people. At this point, the count stands at over 6,000 people dead, over 30,000 people wounded, and more than 1 million refugees from the region, which left both to Russia and to Ukraine to escape the war zone. All of that's very much unfortunate because there's civilians dying over there. There's indiscriminate shellings of cities. They're using cluster bombs. They're actually using phosphorus bombs. And those are weapons which have been forbidden by all sorts of international conventions and treaties. And the interesting thing is that at the moment, the government of Canada, or specifically the conservative government of Mr. Harper, is providing clear support to the Ukrainian army. They're actually already sending non-lethal aid, like military aid. I'm talking about armored vehicles, I'm talking about armored vests, helmets, all sort of stuff like that, which is going directly over to the Ukrainian army, and they're the people who are basically shelling peaceful cities. And the interesting thing is that, like last week, the deputy foreign minister of Ukraine came over to Ottawa with an official visit, and he basically asked our government to provide them with lethal aid this time around. So what they want is basically weapons being sent to them so they could use them again to kill more civilians. The interesting thing is that, and I mean it's really mind-boggling, is that no one talks about the fact that those weapons are being used against civilians. They're not talking about phosphorus bombs or cluster bombs or anything like that. They're not talking about, you know, ultra-nationalistic forces which are actually in the Ukrainian government right now. Some of the volunteer battalions that you see over there, they actually have swastika right over there on their flags. They have people with swastika tattoos, and they're openly proud about basically doing that. So the interesting thing is that the Canadian government is de facto, and the American government is de facto supporting like very right-wing, ultra-nationalistic, fascist government at the moment. And what's worrying about that is that if lethal aid actually starts flowing over to Ukraine, and if it keeps going on like that, then Russia will also start openly supplying weapons, and this could definitely escalate into the next World War. That's at least that's one scenario that could happen. Otherwise, it's going to be potentially there might be a potential for peace if basically both sides stop killing each other, if they stop shooting each other, and if there's no more lethal or any sort of military aid to both sides. So that's kind of what we're standing here for. We think that there should be humanitarian aid actually provided to the civilians over there, and that we should not be arming fascists, we should not be sending weapons to a war zone, and we should not be spending our taxpayers' money, basically our income tax, all of that is going towards a war. Now, do you guys want your taxes going towards a war? I don't think so, neither do we. So the only solution that we see over there is peaceful negotiations and people actually talking to each other, trying to figure out how to make it happen, how they can live with each other after the conflict. Because otherwise it will keep going on, it will keep escalating. There might be an actual third world war, and we definitely do not want any of that. So that's kind of my intro into the entire thing, and I'll have Avneet continue with that.
All right, well, thank you, Dennis. I'm going to keep my remarks under 30 minutes because we are also late, and I don't want people to miss out on the question and answer period. Pretty much what I want to say is, well, we are here to address the present crisis, not just affecting Ukraine, but the entire mankind. And the solutions which are required for mankind to end those local crises permanently. Because right now there is a grave danger for thermonuclear war, but there's also an immense unprecedented opportunity to stop such wars from ever repeating again. And I'll go more into that later. But for now, what you have in the past week, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, the American economist and statesman we work with, he has sharpened his analysis even more, which is being corroborated internationally by other experts, where LaRouche said that the empire is not, we can't be vague in just saying they're going for all-out general thermonuclear war. What they want is a limited nuclear war. There's right now an intense debate between nuclear analysts and experts in circles in Washington, D.C., in London, the neocon, neoliberal circles, whether can the United States launch a limited thermonuclear war against Russia, and would that be successful? Which is totally insane, which is totally dubious, and I'll go into that more. But let me just quote Mr. LaRouche on that. This is a document which can be found on our American website, larouchepac.com, titled Operation Zeus. And I'm only going to quote 2 paragraphs from it, where LaRouche says, we have a situation in which we have to recognize the characteristics of the situation we are operating in. That is that we're on the verge of being pulled into a potential of a thermonuclear war. But the idea of the thermonuclear war is not quite what Obama or Obama thinkers would imagine. Because the situation is such that if you want to take an optimal estimate of how this thing will work out, you would have to say that the Eurasian area is the area in which the British, even though they don't have much to be able to do anything strategically, but they would waste much of Eurasia for the sake of what they want, which is their fun and games. The danger lies essentially in the focus within Western Europe and Eurasia. I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but that is the likely case. The likely case is that it is not the United States which will be hit hard, although of course it will be hit, but Eurasia will be hit hard. That's pretty much obvious right now. That being the case, we have to change the way people understand the threat of a general thermonuclear war. And what most people would assume to be the characteristic threat is something which I would say on my best guess is not what's going to happen. But rather the full blast, the destructive force will be in the Eurasian mainland and southern parts accordingly. That's where the problem lies. And that's only a text of his analysis, but this comes because right now, this analysis has been strengthened because there have been many recent developments. The first of all being the almost immediate firing, if you can say, of Malcolm Rifkind, who was the chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee of the United Kingdom Parliament. And he was also former foreign secretary, and who had been a very outspoken critic of the whole, Russia stance of the West, of the whole antagonizing of the West against Russia. And what you had pretty much in 48 hours this past week of him coming out against that stance of the West, and leading within 48 hours to his firing. And this is really interesting because what his Senate and Intelligence Committee was doing, not only were they a very outspoken, important force within the British Parliament against such an insane, delusional war that wouldn't work, but they were also looking into privacy and security issues arising out of the leaks by the NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. And what he had expressed was that, and also grave concerns against conflict against Russia. And this analysis by him came days after that the former MI6 head, Sir John Sawyers, came out also saying that we need to tone down the whole propaganda against Russia. And also, other than that, in the United Kingdom, there has been a very growing list of American diplomats, people in the American establishment who have been coming out, organizing against the war, and in many cases using our material. I'm going to just close this. So what you have right now is a long list of American diplomats. You have Paul Craig Roberts, who was a very important figure in Ronald Reagan's administration. You have people like Jack Matlock, who was ambassador under Ronald Reagan to Soviet Union, who gave an unprecedented press conference in National Press Club 2 weeks ago, basically organizing against the Obama's war drive. And the most important figure recently is somebody called William Polk, who was a top John F. Kennedy diplomat, a person in John F. Kennedy's administration, very much involved in the Cuba Missile Crisis dialogue, where he wrote an article, which can be found on our website and Google, where he says, I'm just going to quote one line, he says, "The folly of a limited nuclear war is dangerous because it is absolutely preposterous." The very fact that the empire thinks they're going to get away with it is absolutely preposterous. Because what they expect, what they think is that there's going to be a limited response to such a limited warfare. But that is not what Russia, and that's not what Putin has said. Because in Putin's mind, and in the mind of every thinking person in Russia and outside Russia, they know that if the intention for the war by the empire is real, then we have to be fully prepared for a full-out strike, for a full-out attack against that strike, and in some cases even go before. And which is our role, which is our movement's role in Canada and the United States, because our role is to convince the American and Canadian population about the intention, that the intention is war. They might think that it's limited, but we have to organize and convince the people here that is insane, that would not work. And we also have to convince that, that's the role of Mr. LaRouche and his wife Helga LaRouche, that we are the convincing factor to the Russians that the West is not crazy, that the citizens are standing up, which means we have to organize intensely and immediately to stop that. But I would encourage people to go on our website to watch Jack Matlock's presentation, which can be found on YouTube, to read the articles by William Polk, Paul Craig Roberts, other figures, because another thing that follows from all this is that something that we wish to correct in people's mind is that the present American establishment's policy is not American. It's an adopted policy. It's a hijacked policy. Because the American Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were a continuation of a totally humanist legacy of Prometheus. In fact, Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the American Constitution, was known at his time as the modern Prometheus, or the new Prometheus, very popularly. And this is something which people should really look into, should study his writings, because he was somebody who was on one hand arguing for the freedom for not just the colonies, but the idea of freedom, was arguing for freedom of humanity, arguing for a concept of a republic, where he famously said, "We've created a republic if you can keep it." But he was also simultaneously in London battling the concepts of Newtonian physics, battling for the ideas of Leibniz, for Gottfried Leibniz, the famous German physicist who was the real inventor of calculus and modern physics. So this is something really important to understand, because the present American establishment it has adopted basically the policies of the British Empire. It's a tool of the British Empire, which means it's militarily and financially, it is a complete tool of the empire. And we have to get United States especially, but the entire world, to break from that dead system. And that system is dead, because there is no such thing as a present financial system of the West. That's an oxymoron, because the system died in 2007. It popped in 2007, it died, and no amount of bailouts. I mean, we have $2 quadrillion in derivatives debt today in the world financial system in the West. But it has no power to change humanity. It has absolutely no power. Since 2007, all you've seen in the United States or in Europe is just budget cuts and total genocidal austerity. And it is genocide, which is, it is a humanitarian genocide crisis, which has been said by many United Nations missions, which have been sent to Detroit to study the conditions in Greece, Spain, and they've all come to the same conclusion, that it is a completely humanitarian crisis that these bankers are putting these people through. There is no need. Never in history has austerity worked. So the point is that what you have right now in the present debt financial system is $2 quadrillion or more of assets, which is not an asset, it's a burden. It's a complete burden on the financial system, on the entire populations of the West, which includes Canada, United States, and Europe. And our fight is to completely eliminate that with something called Glass-Steagall. And I'm not going to go into much about Glass-Steagall, but we have material outside, but Glass-Steagall is something which would trigger a complete bankruptcy of the current financial system. This is something that was done about 70, 80 years ago by Franklin Roosevelt, America's president in 1930s, to separate Wall Street from the real financial system. And that is our fight today. That is the adopted fight by the people of Greece, for example. You have right now in Greece a very strong resistance to the austerity, not just for the Greek people, but for the entire Europe, where the Syriza party, which is the recent party in the government in Greece, has picked up the fight to not just eliminate the debt for the Greek people, but to reorganize, but to convene a debt conference for all of Europe, which is something very phenomenal, because that it's something which was LaRouche's policy in 1980s. It was called the debt bomb. That if all the creditors unite and stand up against these Wall Street and London bankers and say, we're not going to pay you full value, we're going to be the ones negotiating the debt, and that's when you call the bluff, because there is no way the bankers are going to cash that debt. There is no way those bankers are going to get any money, not a single penny, from the people, if people unite behind a leadership, behind an idea. So what you have right now is Greece, especially being the trigger for all this, partly because they have no choice, as Mr. LaRouche said. They are going to do this because they have no choice but to eliminate the debt. And what you're having people in Greece, like the Syriza party and the Independent Greek Party, which is the other coalition party along with the Syriza party in the government, they're increasingly looking to Eurasia. They're increasingly looking to the BRICS nations for collaboration, where you have China, who proposed to the Greek government that, hey, we can help you build the largest port in Europe. We should do that. Which is something that the Greek people wanted to do under the European Union, but it never happened. So this is something that the Greek people are realizing, that we need to collaborate with the BRICS nations. We need to work with Russia, India, China, South Africa increasingly, and reject the complete bankers' dictatorship imposed from Brussels and London. So what you're having is, people are realizing there is an alternative to the whole blackmail, to the whole austerity, which has dominated Europe and the West since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. And this is pretty much what it comes down to, that you have right now, to sum it up, you have two systems before the world. You have a humanist system, the BRICS system, which is a continuation of the legacy of the American Declaration of Independence, a continuation of the legacy of the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe, continuation of a legacy of Solon of Greece, where the idea is the most important resource, the most important treasure in a system, in a culture, is the human mind and the fostering of the human mind's capability. And that is one system. The other system is inherently an empire. It is a Zeusian system, which is really important because, if you look in the news today, people tend to think the enemy is a country. Oh, it's Israel, it's America, it's Canada. Because, and that's a false accusation, because the idea of a nation itself is a very new concept, which came about in 1600s, especially since the Treaty of Westphalia, the concept of a nation as we know it. And this is something that it's a narrative. It's a very popular narrative where anti-Israel is, anti-this, anti-this, anti-Ukraine, blah, 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 which is not entirely true, because that doesn't get to the root of the matter. Much more older than a nation is an empire, is a concept of an empire, which is especially a Zeusian empire, which seeks to enslave man, which assumes falsely that man is an animal, that it is nothing but an animal, and if we keep them that way, if we give them their pleasure, if we give them their animalistic pleasures, they're never going to demand anything else, even if they are suffering. And that is something which people have to, which is our intention today in the presentations, to get people a deeper sense of what is mankind. How do you build a country? Which is something that the BRICS nations have taken up, but it is not confined to the Eurasian area. They're picking up principles and the fights of Mr. LaRouche, which we have waged for 40 years. Which brings to the other idea, the idea about mankind, because we are not determined. We don't operate in linear time. Because what you're having, for example, the crisis today, what you're having since July of last year, when you had the BRICS conference, and you've had complete expansion of this process forward. The BRICS conference had set up an organization called the BRICS Bank, or the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is just $100 million, starting fund. And the whole idea was that we're gonna have this bank fully functioning next year. But right now, the intention is to get this bank fully functioning this year, by the end of this year, so that they can actually start investing in capital-intensive, high technological projects in entire Eurasia and beyond. So you're having right now, in the past 8 months, you have a full explosion of a very directed fight against the empire, led by a few countries who are taking this opportunity to provide the leadership for the entire humanity. And that's what the Greek people are realizing. Which is, and that is something which people have to understand, that you have right now, like even if you look in the Bible, there's two kinds of time that is talked about. There are two kinds of time that are talked about. There's a chronological time, which is linear time, clock time, which is also known as the Zeus time. And then there's the creative time, chronos and kryos. That's what the text calls it. But the chronological time is linear time, where people, yes, is it chronos and kryos? Kryos. Chronological time is linear time. It's clock time, where people, when they see something happening repeatedly, they say, well, that's the way it is. You can't change it. Could you hold the questions till later? Cryos. I'm pretty sure that's how it's spelled. And chronos, Cronos, yes. And that's chronological time, where people get used to something happening again and again, which is something you get a lot when you're organizing somebody, that, well, wars are continuous. They just happen. It's just the way it is. Get used to it. And then you have the kryos, or creative time, which is mankind's idea of time, is that we're not bound by past experiences. Humanity isn't bound by past experiences. Discoveries are not dependent on something, on the fact that, it hasn't worked in millions of years, so it's never going to work. That's never been our fight. That is something that has best been observed in real humanists, people who have taken up a fight to develop mankind, people like Joan of Arc. Before Joan of Arc, the French army suffered defeat after defeat after defeat for about 100 years against the British. And with her leadership, with her moral commitment to change it, what you had was the French finally won a very significant victory against the empire. And that's what you have today. You have the BRICS nations and the Greek and the Greece, which pretty much Greece hasn't risen since the poisoning of Socrates, since the collapse of the Greek civilization after the Peloponnesian Wars. And what you have in Greece today is a rediscovery of the principles of how you build a civilization, which is the advantage in a crisis. Because in a crisis, people are forced to understand, well, what do we do? How should we build an economy? How should we build a culture? And that is something which is our fight, to not get panicked in the crisis, to not be victimized in the crisis, to be Promethean. Because I would encourage everybody to go back and study Aeschylus's play, Prometheus Bound, where Prometheus is chained to a rock by Zeus, by the emperor, and his liver is picked every day. And Prometheus doesn't, Prometheus doesn't give up. Prometheus is told by all the gods to just give up on the fight. You're not going to win. You're standing up against Zeus. My God, that's just never going to work. But in the end, if you look at the end, what happens? It's Zeus that collapses. And Prometheus has to suffer, but he knows that he's suffering for a higher principle. And that is the beauty about mankind, is that we can undergo pain for a higher principle. We can reject the empire's pleasures. We can go through pain willfully to fight for what's good, which is our fight today. is to get people a sense that the power we have today is in our ideas. It's in the ideas of Friedrich Schiller, which will be a presentation today at the very end. It's in the ideas of fusion, which is gonna unleash the real technological power in all of humanity, and all over the globe, which is something that is a very strong intention by the government of China today, which it also includes the space program. So that's pretty much what I want to end with, is that, if you look at the power we have today in the BRICS on Eurasian side, and the West, and the complete lack of power, really, of the empire, of the bankers. They have no power. They are completely bankrupt. And all they can do is launch a limited nuclear strike and think they're going to win, which is a complete insanity. And we have to tell them that. That is insane. BRICS orientation. And after my presentation, I'm going to have Jean-Philippe Leblou give a presentation on Kepler, which is our presentation, which is going to be in French. So people need translations. There are devices outside. After Jean-Philippe, we're going to have Bob Hux present on fusion and the power that's necessary for nations to harness fusion. And the last presentation after that is going to be Dave Gosselin on Schiller, Friedrich Schiller. So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. The whole presentation is going to be about 2.5 hours. We're going to leave 30 minutes for question and answer, so please save your questions till the last. Please stay till the very end. And please put your phones on silent, and I'm going to bring Dennis right now. Well, my name is Avneet Thapar. I'm a full-time activist with the Committee for the Republic of Canada and the International Movement. And I'm going to give a short synopsis of the whole event today. I'm going to make a short introduction, which I'm doing currently. Then I'm going to introduce Dennis Lastnam, who is a representative of the Russian community in Montreal, who has been very active along with this community in organizing and educating the public about the war danger and the Nazi coup in Ukraine, which includes not just people who are, it's not just the Russian community, but also people in Ukraine, people from the Ukrainian community, people from the general Eastern European community. And after Dennis's presentation, I'm going to give an overview of the strategic war danger and the
percent of all the population actually voted to quit Ukraine and enter Russia. And that's pretty much what happened in retrospect. That's when Crimea became part of Russia. First they became independent, then they went to Russia. However, in eastern Ukraine, there's other provinces as well, specifically Lugansk province and Donetsk province. They kind of looked at what happened at Crimea, and they thought, well, what if we follow the same way type of thing? What if we also decide to kind of, they actually didn't want to separate. At this point, they wanted to have a federalization of Ukraine, so basically changing the way the government works. They wanted to have more rights for the different provinces over there. Especially one of the key demands that they had was having a regional language as Russian, because the population there, 80% of them are basically, well, they're Russian speaking. So we're looking at that as kind of a situation in Quebec where most of the majority of the population is French speaking. Ultra-nationalistic movements in Ukraine, they include the Pravy sector, which means right sector. It's very right-wing, very nationalistic, and as well as the Svoboda party, which is basically the Freedom Party, but the name is really misleading. So those guys, they decided to kind of do a campaign against the legally elected pro-Russian government back in the day. They started by doing the Euromaidan, which you might have followed in the news. That kind of escalated into clashes with the police. It went over to quite a lot of brutality, but eventually the government was overthrown. What happened later on is that Crimea, that was the first region of Ukraine in the eastern Ukraine, which decided to basically separate from Ukraine because they said that you guys just did an illegal overthrow of the government, a military coup d'etat. We can no longer stay in the same boat. There was a referendum held over there at which over 96%. Hi everyone, so my name is Dennis. I'm from the Russian community here in Montreal. We're actually organizing like weekly events on every Saturday. Well, yeah, we're basically organizing like weekly events to try and educate the public about what's going on in Eastern Ukraine and basically what's the danger of all of that when it comes to the global society and basically the global world and the vision of what it could transpire. So basically, as you probably know, that there's been conflict that's been going on for about a year in Ukraine so far. Not sure how many of you know about the actual origins of the conflict, so I'm going to give you a very short overview of what's happened. So basically, last February, there was an illegally elected government that was overthrown by some